Welcome back. For those preparing for the CSS and PMS exams, understanding the actual mechanics of constitutional reform is critical. I'm Sohaib Ahmed Anjem. Let's examine a specific high-level prompt you might face. Analyze the political economy of constitutional reform in Pakistan. Why does the 18th Amendment remain contested despite its broad consensus at the time of passage? To answer that, we have to start in 2010. The 18th Amendment was passed with near-unanimous political backing, a rare moment of unified legislative agreement. Yet, over a decade later, that same amendment faces relentless structural pushback from almost every major organ of the state. The agreement on paper has translated into ongoing institutional warfare in practice. This happens because constitutional reform in Pakistan rarely stems from broad popular mobilization. Instead, these reforms operate as elite bargains, negotiated settlements made during transitions of power. The 2010 bargain forced a severe realignment of state power. Authority was pulled from the traditional military and bureaucratic center and transferred to the provinces. To deconstruct why this shift remains so fiercely contested, we will examine it through three specific analytical lenses: fiscal friction, distributional conflict, and institutional culture. A top-scoring essay cannot just summarize the law. You have to map exactly how the amendment redirected the flow of money and power. The primary legal mechanism of the 18th Amendment was the abolition of the concurrent legislative list. Key administrative subjects, like health, education, and culture, were handed directly to the provincial governments. Transferring those responsibilities meant transferring the money to fund them. This required a permanent, massive increase in the provincial share of the National Finance Commission, or NFC, award. This chart shows the distribution of the national budget. Notice how the federal government's slice of the pie shrank drastically to accommodate the newly empowered provinces. But Islamabad still held massive, non-negotiable financial obligations that did not shrink alongside its revenue. The immense costs of national defense and foreign debt servicing remained entirely on the federal ledger. The math simply broke down. The rigid costs of maintaining the state now regularly exceed the center's reduced share of the revenue, locking Islamabad into a permanent structural deficit. This immediate fiscal crisis generates relentless pressure from the federal government to claw back those resources and revisit the entire devolution settlement. International financial institutions and foreign donors often reinforce this centralizing pressure. When negotiating structural loans, they prefer dealing with a single, centralized fiscal authority rather than multiple provincial capitals. The 2010 bargain engineered a state where the center absorbs the debt burden, while the provinces capture the revenue growth. This misalignment keeps the two tiers of government locked in a cycle of institutional conflict. That fiscal reality deeply alarms the traditional seat of power in Islamabad. For decades, the central civil bureaucracy and the security establishment have operated on the premise that a strong, highly centralized state is the only way to maintain national cohesion. In these circles, robust provincial autonomy represents a direct threat to national security and a severe dilution of their traditional institutional influence. This institutional anxiety becomes even sharper when we look at the physical geography of the country, specifically the control over natural wealth. Resource-rich provinces like Balochistan and Sindh view the amendment as a crucial legal tool.
It gives them the authority to claim the revenues generated by their own land and minerals. We are talking about large-scale industrial assets and critical energy infrastructure that suddenly shifted toward greater provincial purview. The federal establishment fears losing absolute control over these strategic energy lifelines to local political leaders whose interests might not align with Islamabad's security priorities. For the central establishment, the 18th Amendment decentralized both sovereign authority and control over the state's most vital economic engines. The execution of the amendment introduced its own set of deeply flawed dynamics, most notably the phenomenon of elite capture at the provincial level. The power and patronage extracted from Islamabad did not trickle down to democratize local municipalities. The transfer simply stopped at the provincial capitals. This network flowchart demonstrates how the massive influx of new resources was essentially intercepted. The financial lines bypassed local governments entirely, enriching new centers of patronage controlled by provincial elites. This sparked severe intra-provincial tensions, as marginalized rural populations saw the center of power shift from the federal capital to the provincial one. This lack of downward devolution gave the federal center its most potent counterargument, the administrative capacity gap. On the ground, many districts operate heavily in the informal economy and lack the robust, modern administrative infrastructure needed to manage massive new departmental budgets. Federal critics actively highlight the resulting failures in basic, everyday service delivery, pointing out severe shortfalls in provincial healthcare management and public education. These real-world delivery failures are consistently used by Islamabad to build a powerful narrative that the provinces lack the administrative capacity to handle the responsibilities they demanded.
The rushed devolution process inadvertently built powerful provincial fiefdoms. Now, their genuine administrative shortcomings provide the central government the perfect justification to constantly demand re-centralization. When we step back and look at the landscape over a decade later, we see a framework plagued by persistent, macro-level structural flaws. The most immediate issue is incomplete implementation. The exact legal division of administrative functions between the center and the provinces remains highly ambiguous and actively contested in the courts. This ambiguity is dangerous because of how the amendment was born. Negotiated entirely in closed-door meetings among political elites, without broad public debate, the settlement lacks a grassroots shield to defend it against elite reversal. But the deepest barrier is historical. Pakistan possesses a heavily entrenched, centralizing political culture that constantly pulls authority back toward the middle. This institutional instinct directly clashes with the written, legal logic of robust federalism, creating an environment of perpetual friction. So how do you translate this complex dynamic into a top-tier CSS or PMS essay? First, you must reject binary framing. Do not evaluate the amendment as either a pure democratic victory or a total governance failure. Examiners see through that simplicity. Instead, use this specific framework. Analyze the 18th Amendment strictly as an ongoing, unresolved negotiation over who controls natural resources and who wields institutional power. Moving past basic constitutional memorization and mapping the actual political economy of these reforms is exactly what will separate a standard paper from a top-scoring exam.